The first time I realized they weren't coming, I was standing at the doorway, my hands gripping the faded oak frame as if holding on would somehow bring them back. The sun had begun to dip below the rooftops, painting the street in golden light that should have felt warm but instead only highlighted the emptiness of my small living room. I had set the table for dinner hours earlier, placing my son's favorite plate in its usual spot, the silverware polished and shining. My heart tightened when I remembered he used to laugh at how I fussed over the table settings, how I made the smallest gestures feel monumental. Back then, they mattered. Now, they were gone. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards under my own careful steps. I waited. Every evening I waited. The pattern had begun months ago, almost imperceptibly at first. I would glance at the clock, hoping for the familiar sound of their car pulling up, their voices echoing through the hallway, and yet the driveway remained empty. I would tell myself it was just a bad day, maybe a meeting ran late, or traffic held them up. But the next evening, the same silence greeted me, and then the next. Eventually, the hope clung to me like a second skin, refusing to let me fully accept the truth, even when my heart ached and my throat tightened with the weight of disappointment. It wasn't that I didn't understand why they had grown distant. Life had a way of pulling people apart, of stretching bonds thin without anyone noticing until the gaps were too wide to cross. My son had always been ambitious, focused on his career, his friends, his own family. I had tried not to resent him, not aloud anyway, but the sting of being forgotten, of being treated as an afterthought, was sharper than anything I had anticipated. I had raised him with hands that bore the calluses of sacrifice, fingers cracked from years of scrubbing floors and tending gardens, palms burned from handling the hot pans of meals made with love. I had done it all quietly without complaint, never expecting recognition, yet always hoping for presence. And now as I stood in that familiar doorway, the walls around me echoing with the memories of laughter and small celebrations, I understood in a way that no words could convey just how fragile the promise of family could be. The first time I picked up the phone to call him, I rehearsed the words over and over in my head. "Hello, is everything all right? Are you coming home soon?" I imagined his voice warm and familiar, telling me not to worry, assuring me that he would be there shortly. But when I dialed, the line went straight to voicemail. Again and again I left messages, each one carefully crafted to sound casual, to mask the fear and loneliness bubbling beneath the surface. I told myself not to panic, that he must be busy, that life sometimes got in the way. But as the days stretched into weeks, a quiet despair began to settle around me like dust in an unused room. I had become invisible in the life I had built, the person who once held everything together now treated as though I were already gone. And yet, despite the absence, despite the sting of rejection, I refused to give up on hope entirely. Each evening I would move to the doorway again, placing my hands lightly against the frame, listening intently for the sound of tires on the gravel or the familiar squeak of the gate. I would stare at the horizon, watching the sun's descent, imagining what it would feel like to see them arrive, to hear laughter spilling into the room once more. I would close my eyes and picture them stepping inside, their arms open, their smiles genuine, the tension of the weeks dissolving in a single embrace. These daydreams became my sustenance, my quiet rebellion against the creeping shadow of solitude. There were nights when I would sit in the darkened kitchen, a single lamp casting a pool of soft light across the counter, and write letters I never sent. I wrote about my days, my memories, the little victories I celebrated alone, the meals I prepared and imagined sharing. I wrote about the fear that sometimes gripped me when the silence became too loud, about the ache in my chest when I realized I had been replaced not by choice, but by circumstance. Each word on the paper was a plea, a testament to the life I had lived, the love I had given, and the hope that somehow someone would remember. But the letters remained in neat piles, untouched, a silent record of devotion and loss. And yet, there was a subtle shift that occurred during these long evenings of waiting. Something inside me began to harden, not into bitterness, but into resolve. I realized that the love I had poured into others had never been wasted, that the life I had lived, the sacrifices I had made, were theirs to carry with them, whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. I began to take note of my own strength, the quiet fortitude that had allowed me to endure years of toil, grief, and unacknowledged labor. I remembered the small triumphs, the times I had risen after setbacks, the moments I had protected those I loved even when it cost me dearly. And with each recollection, I felt a spark of power ignite within me, a gentle reminder that though they had abandoned me in presence, they could never erase the life I had lived, the dignity I still held, or the choices I still had the right to make. It was during one of these evenings, as the sky deepened into shades of violet and the street lights flickered to life, that I noticed a small movement across the yard. A shadow, subtle and hesitant, lingered near the fence, as though unsure whether to cross the threshold. I froze, heart hammering, unsure whether it was real or merely a figment of hope manifesting itself again. And then, slowly, a figure emerged, tentative and familiar. My son's own child, a boy whose laughter I had cherished and whose milestones I had celebrated quietly from the sidelines, stepped into the light, eyes wide with hesitation, gaze searching. In that instant, the ache of weeks and months condensed into a single sharp realization. The bond of family, though stretched and frayed, was not entirely severed. There was still a thread, fragile yet undeniable, connecting my heart to theirs, a thread that could not be broken by absence alone. I invited him in without a word, simple opening the door wider, my hand resting lightly on the frame, a silent welcome. He crossed the threshold cautiously, glancing back as though expecting disapproval, yet finding none. Together we moved to the kitchen, where the familiar scent of simmering stew and baked bread offered comfort and a sense of continuity. I handed him a cup of warm tea, just as I had when he was small, and he sipped with the reverence of someone recognizing a safe harbor he had long forgotten. We sat in quiet companionship, the unspoken understanding between us bridging the distance of absence, creating a fragile but real reconnection. In the weeks that followed, I continued to wait at the doorway, but the waiting took on a new meaning. No longer was it a gesture of longing alone. It became a practice of patience, of quiet strength, a testament to the endurance of hope tempered by wisdom. I came to see that their absence did not define me, nor did it diminish the life I had lived or the love I had given. Instead, it revealed the power I had always possessed, the ability to withstand disappointment, to maintain dignity in solitude, and to create space for connection on my own terms. And so each evening, as the light faded and shadows stretched long across the floorboards, I continued to wait at the door, hands resting on the familiar frame, eyes scanning the horizon. But now, the anticipation was tempered by resolve, a quiet confidence in the knowledge that life could still hold moments of joy, of reunion, and of recognition even after the deepest of absences. The doorway became not a symbol of loss, but of endurance, a threshold between despair and hope, between what had been taken and what could still be reclaimed. As I stood there, the hum of the refrigerator a gentle counterpoint to the beating of my heart, I realized that waiting was not weakness. Waiting was an act of faith, of courage, of acknowledgement that the heart could continue to hope even when the world seemed to forget. And in that realization, I found a measure of peace, the knowledge that no matter how long the wait, I had not been erased, I had not been abandoned entirely, and that the life I had built, and the love I had given still had the power to draw those I cherished back into its orbit. The days after that first hesitant visit became a rhythm of cautious reconnection, though the wounds left by absence ran deeper than any smile could erase. I watched my grandson Tyler navigate the delicate balance between curiosity and wariness, and I realized how much time had passed since I had last been the center of their lives in any meaningful way. His questions were tentative at first, small inquiries about the garden, about the food I cooked, about memories I had once shared casually, but each one was a thread weaving us closer together. I answered patiently, recalling stories in vivid detail, remembering the laughter and small victories of years long gone, the echoes of holidays spent together, the afternoons when he had curled up in my lap as I read aloud. Those memories were mine, and now, in the careful unfolding of our afternoons, they became a shared refuge, a reminder that family could still exist beyond the shadows of neglect. Yet, the presence of Tyler brought with it a quiet tension. I could sense the hesitation in his movements, the way he glanced at the empty chair at the table, a seat once reserved for his parents, and then quickly looked away. I understood he had been caught between loyalty to his parents and the comfort he found in my home, a home that still smelled of lavender and old wood of pie cooling on the counter, of history preserved in photographs and careful routines. I didn't push him, didn't press for explanations. I simply allowed him to exist in the space I offered, to find solace in a grandmother's attention without judgment or expectation. In doing so, I realized that patience was its own form of power, the ability to hold space without demand, to nurture trust slowly, deliberately, without forcing it to bloom prematurely. In those quiet afternoons, I began to notice the subtle changes in myself as well. The loneliness that had once felt crushing began to shift, replaced by a sense of agency I hadn't felt in years. Standing at the doorway waiting, I had learned endurance. Sitting with Tyler, sharing stories and simple meals, I began to recognize the quiet victories and small acts of love and attention. I started taking time for myself, brushing dust from the windows to let the sunlight fall across the floors, tending to the garden in deliberate motions, planting marigolds and roses whose blooms would outlast my own lifetime. Each movement was an assertion of presence, a declaration that I was still here, still capable, still deserving of space and care. The contrast between the absence of my son and the presence of my grandson was stark, and it did not escape me. Jason had once been the center of my world, the child whose life I had shaped with endless effort, whose milestones I had celebrated quietly and fiercely. Yet now, he had become a ghost in my memories, his absence a gaping reminder of what it meant to give fully and receive nothing in return. Tyler, in contrast, offered a quiet redemption, a chance to nurture love without the shadow of betrayal. I cherished the moments we shared, knowing that each laugh, each glance of understanding was a stitch in the fabric of resilience I was weaving for both of us. One evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops and cast long shadows across the living room, Tyler asked a question that took my breath away. "Grandma, do you think he'll come back?" His voice was small, almost fragile, and I could feel the weight of his hope, the longing that had carried him across the threshold of my home, despite the years of distance and absence. I looked at him, at the boy who had inherited so much of his father's ambition and so little of his awareness, and I realized that my answer would shape more than just his evening. It would shape the understanding of family he carried with him into adulthood. I chose my words carefully. "Sometimes people leave," I said softly, placing a hand over his small one resting on the table, "and sometimes they come back. But whether they come back or not doesn't change who we are, or the love we've already shared. You have a choice, Tyler. You can remember what matters, or let the absence define you. I hope you choose the first." His eyes glistened in the soft lamplight, and he nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what I had said. In that moment, I realized that the true work of family of legacy was not in forcing reconciliation or demanding presence, but in imparting the understanding that love, care, and dignity could exist independently of recognition. As the days turned into weeks, I began to reclaim other parts of my life that had been quietly neglected. I visited the local library, reconnecting with books and authors I had loved but had abandoned during the years consumed by caretaking and sacrifice. I joined a small knitting circle at the community center, where women of my age shared stories, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of creating something tangible with their hands. These connections, though seemingly minor, reinforced a growing realization that life's richness was not contingent solely on the presence of those who had abandoned me. My joy, my agency, and my peace could be nurtured independently, and that knowledge became a fortress against the sting of betrayal. Meanwhile, the dynamics at the house across the street were becoming increasingly apparent. I could see glimpses of my son and his wife through the windows, their movements tense, their interactions tinged with discomfort. It was clear that they were adjusting to a new reality, one in which they had assumed control without consent and now faced the consequences of their own decisions. I did not gloat. I did not intervene. I simply observed, allowing the natural consequences of their choices to unfold, confident that justice, when paired with patience and awareness, often spoke louder than any confrontation. There was satisfaction in watching from a distance, not because I sought revenge, but because it affirmed the truth I had been nurturing quietly for months, that my life, my dignity, and my agency could not be stolen. No matter how brazen the attempts to erase me, Tyler became my partner in small acts of reclamation. Together, we tended the garden, planted new vegetables, and painted sections of the porch that had long been neglected. Each act was symbolic, a reclaiming not just of physical space but of emotional territory, of the rhythms and rituals that defined our shared life. Through these actions, he learned the value of responsibility, of care, and of resilience, witnessing firsthand the quiet strength that had carried me through years of neglect and labor. And through it all, I learned to balance the joy of these small victories with the lingering ache of absence, acknowledging both without allowing either to dominate my days. One afternoon, as we were planting tulips along the side of the driveway, Tyler paused and looked up at me. "Grandma, why didn't he come?" His question was simple, yet loaded with the complexity of emotion, a reflection of both the innocence of youth and the sharp awareness that absence can bring. I knelt beside him, planting a small bloom in the rich soil, and considered how to answer. "Sometimes," I said finally, "people make choices that hurt others, not because they don't love them, but because they are caught up in their own lives and struggles. That doesn't make it right. But it does mean we can choose how we respond. We can choose to nurture what matters to us rather than dwell on what was taken." Tyler nodded, the understanding dawning slowly, like sunlight filtering through clouds. He picked up a trowel and returned to his work, a quiet smile tugging at his lips, the first sign that he was internalizing the lessons I had spent a lifetime teaching. At night, after Tyler had gone home, I would sit by the window in the dim glow of the lamp, gazing at the house across the street. I watched, not with bitterness, but with the quiet knowledge that my presence, my life, and my choices were still intact. I could see their routines, their attempts at normalcy, but there was a hollowness to it, an absence of authenticity that no effort could disguise. I reminded myself that I was no longer the child's caretaker alone, no longer bound by expectation or obligation. I had emerged from the shadow of neglect into a space defined by choice, patience, and quiet resilience. And so, each evening, I continued to wait at my doorway, but now the waiting was different. It was no longer a desperate plea for presence or acknowledgement. It had transformed into a practice of reflection, of observation, of savoring the small victories of life reclaimed. The doorway became a vantage point, a place to witness both the echoes of what had been lost and the quiet bloom of what was being nurtured in its place. The light from the setting sun spilled across the floorboards, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and I felt a sense of completeness that had been absent for years. In that light, I understood that the essence of family, of legacy, and of love was not solely in those who came or went, but in the life I continued to cultivate, the dignity I maintained, and the connections I fostered through patience, wisdom, and unwavering presence. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet victories and subtle reckonings. Tyler's visits became more frequent, his confidence growing alongside the plants in our garden. The boy had always possessed a keen sense of observation, but now his eyes shone with curiosity and awareness, noticing small details in our home that had once gone unnoticed. He asked about the recipes I cooked, the way I arranged flowers on the table, even why the roses along the fence were positioned just so. Each question was a bridge, connecting the past and present, filling the spaces left hollow by my son's absence. I answered with care, never rushing, allowing him to absorb not only the words but the intent behind them. In teaching him, I taught myself to treasure patience, to understand the subtle power of influence through example rather than demand. Meanwhile, life across the street continued under the weight of tension I could sense without ever needing to see it fully. Jason and Danielle's movements had grown cautious, almost ritualistic, as if they feared that any misstep would be observed and judged. I did not interfere, nor did I gloat. That had never been the point. What mattered was the restoration of my own autonomy, the reclaiming of space, both physical and emotional, and the establishment of boundaries that could no longer be breached. From the porch, I would see Danielle's forced smiles when neighbors waved, Jason's stiff posture when he checked the mailbox, and the palpable anxiety that had replaced the confidence they had once exuded. It was a quiet victory, a proof of the power of patience, of presence, of living deliberately while others floundered under the weight of their own choices. One rainy afternoon, Tyler and I found ourselves sitting on the porch, sipping cocoa and watching the water bead and roll along the roof tiles. The rain brought with it a sense of reflection, as though the world itself had paused to observe us. Tyler broke the silence, asking, "Grandma, do you ever wish things were different?" His voice carried both curiosity and caution, aware of the layers of hurt that had accumulated over years of absence. I smiled softly, taking a moment to consider my response. "Sometimes," I admitted, "I think about the life I imagined for all of us, but wishing doesn't change the past. What changes things is what we do now, the way we hold our hearts, and the choices we make for the future. We can't undo what was done, but we can shape what comes next." Tyler nodded, eyes bright with comprehension, and I realized that this conversation, simple as it seemed, carried more weight than any argument or legal victory ever could. It was about legacy, about teaching him to understand the nuances of life, love, and resilience. The dynamic with Tyler continued to deepen. He would help in the kitchen, asking questions about recipes, sometimes offering suggestions, sometimes simply observing as I moved with practiced ease. I encouraged him to take small responsibilities, folding laundry, watering plants, checking the mailbox. These seemingly ordinary tasks became lessons in accountability and mindfulness, a chance for him to engage actively in life rather than passively observe it. I found joy in these moments, a quiet satisfaction that filled the void left by those who had abandoned their roles. Tyler's presence was a balm to my solitude, a reminder that the seeds we plant, whether in gardens or in hearts, can grow resiliently, even after seasons of neglect. Across the street, subtle shifts were beginning to occur. Jason and Danielle had become predictable in their avoidance of direct eye contact, their interactions constrained by an unspoken awareness that someone else held the moral and emotional high ground. They moved cautiously, as if aware that I could see every nuance, every misstep. I did not taunt, I did not intervene, I simply observed, noting the ways that absence, neglect, and misguided assumptions carry their own consequences. Justice, in this instance, was not in confrontation, but in the quiet assurance that life, lived with integrity and resilience, often exacts its own balance. One evening, while Tyler and I were arranging the garden, a neighbor came over, curious about the bright tulips and marigolds now lining the fence. She smiled warmly, commenting on the vibrancy of the colors and the care that had gone into each plant. I felt a quiet pride swell within me, realizing that community recognition, even in subtle forms, was a reflection of the effort and attention I had invested, not just in the plants, but in reclaiming my life. Tyler beamed at the compliment, clearly pleased to be seen as part of this restoration. These interactions, small as they were, reinforced the understanding that life could flourish when nurtured intentionally, even in the shadow of past neglect. At night, I would sit by the window reflecting on the events that had brought me to this moment. The house across the street remained occupied, yet it was clear that the atmosphere had changed. The once confident steps of my son now carried uncertainty. Danielle's social efforts were loud and performative, yet hollow, lacking the authenticity that comes from genuine connection. From my vantage point, I could witness the consequences of their choices unfold without interference. It was a lesson in perspective, in understanding that sometimes the most profound statements are made, not through words, but through living fully and authentically in the aftermath of betrayal. Tyler began to ask more questions about the past, curious about the childhood stories and family history that had previously been omitted or glossed over. I shared with him the details of birthdays celebrated, holidays endured with joy and fatigue alike, and the countless sacrifices made without expectation of recognition. He listened intently, absorbing the stories not as tales of sorrow, but as lessons in resilience, compassion, and wisdom. In doing so, he learned that family is not defined solely by presence or absence, but by the continuity of care, attention, and integrity across generations. One afternoon, Tyler approached me with a small notebook, similar to the one I had used in the nursing home. "Grandma," he said shyly, "can I start keeping notes too? About what we do, about the garden, about everything?" I smiled at the idea, recognizing in it the natural impulse to record and reflect, to hold space for memory and understanding. I handed him a pen and watched as he began to fill the pages with observations, drawings, and notes. It was a symbolic act, a continuation of the legacy of mindfulness and reflection I had cultivated, a way for him to assert his presence and agency in a world that had too often overlooked it. Meanwhile, the garden flourished. Each plant, each bloom became a testament to resilience and care. The roses along the fence stood tall and vibrant, a deliberate contrast to the quiet tension across the street. Tulips, marigolds, and herbs thrived under careful attention, their colors bright against the muted backdrop of old siding and concrete. Each day, as I walked among the plants with Tyler, I felt a sense of fulfillment that had been absent for years, a recognition that care, attention, and intentionality yield lasting beauty, both in the garden and in the hearts of those nurtured within it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tyler asked a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Grandma, do you ever forgive him?" His voice was tentative, unsure if he wanted the answer. I paused, reflecting on the years of hurt, the careful planning, the patience that had brought me to this moment. "I have," I said softly, "but forgiveness does not mean forgetting, nor does it mean allowing harm to continue. Forgiveness is about freeing yourself from the weight of anger, so you can live fully, so you can create joy and peace without the chains of resentment." Tyler considered this, his eyes thoughtful, and I realized he had internalized the lesson that strength and agency often come not from confrontation, but from the deliberate choice to protect one's own dignity while still holding space for growth and learning. Days turned into weeks, and Tyler's presence continued to solidify a new normal. We developed routines together, gardening in the morning, preparing simple meals in the afternoon, and spending evenings reading or playing cards. Each activity, though ordinary in appearance, carried the weight of restoration, care, and quiet joy. In observing Tyler's growth, I saw the possibility of healing and continuity, the potential for family bonds to be nurtured thoughtfully, without expectation or obligation. Our connection became a counterpoint to the absence and neglect that had defined the previous years, a living testament to resilience, care, and the power of deliberate presence. The following weeks unfolded like chapters in a quiet, deliberate book. Each morning I rose with the sun, listening to the soft hum of life outside, and planned my day not around anyone else's expectations, but around what I valued. Tyler often accompanied me, helping with chores, asking questions, and learning that patience and persistence yield rewards far beyond immediate satisfaction. The rhythm of our days became a comfort, a gentle counterpoint to the chaos that had once defined my relationship with my son. It was as though the world itself was providing a space for reflection, growth, and reclamation, granting me the calm to observe, to plan, and to savor the small victories that come from living intentionally. Across the street, I began to notice subtle changes. Jason's once confident stride now seemed weighed by uncertainty, and Danielle's constant social displays seemed strained, forced, and hollow. I never intervened. My role was not to punish, but to witness the natural consequences of choices made in ignorance and neglect. Observing from my porch, I realized that true power often lies not in confrontation or loud declarations, but in the quiet assertion of presence and integrity. Every day I sat with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood wake and go about its routines. I felt the satisfaction that comes from knowing that I had reclaimed my life without compromise or apology. Tyler's curiosity deepened. One afternoon, as we pruned the rose bushes together, he asked, "Grandma, do you ever think about what it would be like if Mum and Dad were here differently?" I paused, considering the complexity of the question. "I do," I admitted, "but I also understand that we cannot control how others act or the choices they make. What we can control is how we respond, how we nurture the relationships that truly matter, and how we live in a way that reflects our values and dignity." He nodded, seemingly absorbing the lesson. It struck me then that these conversations were more than educational. They were shaping the next generation's understanding of empathy, resilience, and moral courage. In a sense, Tyler's growth became a mirror reflecting the lessons I had learned through hardship and careful observation, amplified through his youthful awareness. We spent more afternoons documenting our lives. Tyler started writing in his notebook, capturing both the mundane and the meaningful. He would sketch the garden, note observations about people and events, and occasionally write small stories inspired by the world around him. I encouraged him to approach this with both creativity and care, reminding him that memory and reflection are powerful tools for understanding one's place in the world. Each page he filled was a record of growth, a small testament to the intentionality that I had cultivated through years of vigilance and planning. One evening, I prepared a simple dinner: roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread, and a small salad from the garden. Tyler helped set the table, and we sat together, talking about the day's events, the progress in the garden, and the small joys we had observed. The ritual was ordinary in appearance, yet profound in meaning. It symbolized continuity, care, and the rebuilding of trust in a world that had previously been defined by abandonment and betrayal. I reflected on the ways in which simple acts of presence and attention could rebuild not just confidence and security, but also the sense of connection and belonging that had been fractured for so long. Meanwhile, I began attending local community events, quietly advocating for elder rights and sharing experiences that had taught me the importance of vigilance, self-advocacy, and empowerment. Each interaction with other seniors, each conversation, reinforced my understanding that isolation and neglect are widespread issues, and that action, however small, can create ripples of awareness and change. Tyler often accompanied me, learning firsthand that standing up for oneself and others does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires observation, preparation, and deliberate, informed choices. Together, we became not just participants, but witnesses and educators, blending personal growth with community impact. One morning, I noticed the neighbors across the street moving with unusual urgency. Boxes were being carried hastily, curtains pulled tighter than before, and a flurry of activity suggested some significant change. I observed silently, knowing that the past would inevitably meet the present in its own time. There was no need to intervene or comment. The natural consequences of neglect, dishonesty, and manipulation were playing out without interference. Tyler, noticing my attention, asked, "Grandma, what's happening over there?" I smiled quietly. "Life," I said. "Sometimes life has a way of balancing itself out." The day Danielle left, driving away with a trunk full of possessions and not a word of acknowledgement, was a moment that required neither celebration nor commentary. It was rather the culmination of careful patience and deliberate choices. Jason remained, his presence heavy with unspoken regret, yet lacking the energy or initiative to address what had transpired. Observing him through the fence, I realized that peace does not always demand confrontation. Sometimes it requires patience, silence, and the confidence that integrity and resilience speak louder than anger or retribution ever could. Tyler, sensing the weight of the moment, stayed close, offering quiet companionship without the need for words. The following days reinforced the lessons we had both been living. Tyler became increasingly involved in the rhythms of our home and garden, taking ownership of small tasks and learning the value of intentional care. I encouraged him to approach each task with mindfulness, reinforcing the connection between deliberate action and meaningful results. Observing his growth, I recognized the continuity of legacy, the ability to pass forward lessons of patience, vigilance, and integrity through example rather than lecture. Each day our bond strengthened, rooted in shared experience, mutual respect, and the quiet joy of connection restored. Across the street, Jason's movements continued to reflect tension, awareness, and the subtle anxiety that accompanies the realization of past mistakes. Danielle's presence was marked by avoidance, her previous displays of control replaced with a muted acknowledgement of boundaries she could not violate. From my porch, I observed the natural unfolding of consequences, appreciating the quiet clarity that comes from living authentically, while others confront the repercussions of their choices. Tyler, observing alongside me, asked insightful questions that demonstrated both comprehension and emotional intelligence, reinforcing the lessons of resilience, accountability, and moral clarity that had been central to our shared experience. As the weeks passed, I began introducing small creative projects into our routine. Painting, journaling, and garden design became shared activities, enriching both Tyler's understanding of aesthetics and our appreciation for deliberate creation. Each brushstroke, each carefully recorded observation, served as a metaphor for the broader principles we were living: patience, attention to detail, and the understanding that meaningful results emerge from consistent, thoughtful effort. Tyler's engagement in these projects demonstrated both skill development and an internalization of the principles I had sought to model, offering reassurance that the lessons of the past were taking root in the next generation. Late one evening, After Tyler had gone to bed, I sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the loneliness of waiting at the door, to the calculated steps that reclaimed my autonomy, to the ongoing cultivation of connection and understanding, each stage had reinforced the value of deliberate choice, resilience, and self-respect. I realized that peace, true peace, is rarely the result of external validation. It emerges from the quiet confidence of knowing that one has acted with integrity, patience, and careful intention. Observing the street now empty, the neighboring house subdued in its activity, I felt a profound sense of closure, tempered by the understanding that life continues in its own rhythm, with opportunities for growth, reflection, and renewal always present. The next morning burned clear and quiet, the kind of sunlight that spilled through the windows and warmed everything it touched without demanding attention. Tyler was up early, as usual, pulling on his sneakers with a focus that reminded me of mornings from years ago when I had to coax Jason out of bed for school. But this was different. There was no rush, no tension, only the rhythm of life reclaimed. He came to me with a small notebook clutched in his hands, pages filled with sketches of the garden and notes about plants and colors. I smiled at the diligence, remembering how easily youth can be lost to distraction, and how rare it was to witness attention sustained over time. "Grandma," he said softly, "I want to paint today, like you did yesterday. Can we start with the roses?" I nodded, retrieving brushes, paints, and the palette. We carried them out to the porch where the morning sun lit the petals of the roses I had planted along the fence. Each flower seemed to embody resilience, beauty, and quiet defiance, much like the life I had worked to reclaim. Tyler settled into his chair, and we painted side by side, speaking little, letting our movements and observations fill the silence with meaning. In that quiet, I realized how far we had come from the empty despair of waiting for someone who never arrived, to the deliberate creation of a space defined by care, attention, and the presence of those who truly mattered. Our routine became a sanctuary, mornings for painting, afternoons for gardening, and evenings for sharing meals we had prepared together. Each activity was carefully chosen to foster reflection, connection, and growth. Tyler asked questions that were both simple and profound about the lives of neighbors, the history of the house, the choices people make, and why some fail to see the consequences of their actions. I answered as best I could, weaving in lessons of patience, resilience, and the power of thoughtful response. He listened, his eyes wide with understanding, absorbing the weight of experiences he had not yet lived, but could begin to comprehend through observation and guidance. Across the street, the dynamics continued to shift. Jason had stopped his occasional porch sightings, and Danielle seemed to avoid the view entirely. Their absence was a relief, yet it carried with it a subtle tension, a lingering reminder that the past can never be entirely erased, only observed and integrated. I chose to focus on what I could shape: the care of the home, the cultivation of the garden, and the nurturing of Tyler's curiosity and moral growth. Each deliberate act of attention reinforced the lessons I had fought so hard to impart, reminding me that influence is often most powerful when wielded quietly, consistently, and with integrity. One afternoon, Tyler asked, "Grandma, why didn't you yell at Mom and Dad? You could have said everything you wanted." I paused, considering how to convey the complexity of the answer in terms a 14-year-old could grasp. "Sometimes," I said, "the loudest voice doesn't carry the most truth. Sometimes patience, observation, and careful action teach lessons more effectively than anger ever could. People learn through consequences, not always through confrontation, and sometimes the quietest presence leaves the strongest impression." Tyler nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the lesson in his own way, realizing that life often communicates through subtleties that only patience allows one to perceive. Our afternoons were frequently punctuated by moments of small wonder: a butterfly landing on a rose, a squirrel carefully navigating the fence, the wind stirring the branches, just enough to create a soft chorus of movement. I used these moments to remind Tyler that attention to detail matters, that beauty and growth emerge not just from grand gestures, but from consistent care and observation. He began recording these small marvels in his notebook, noting patterns, colors, and movements. Over time, his pages became a record, not only of the garden, but of life itself, a testament to the value of mindfulness and the observation of natural rhythms. Meals became a time of reflection and conversation. I taught Tyler to cook, emphasizing the importance of intention in each step, from chopping vegetables with care to measuring spices thoughtfully. As we prepared dinner together, I recounted memories of Jason's childhood, of the lessons I had hoped to impart, and of the sacrifices made to secure a future he ultimately failed to appreciate. Tyler listened, sometimes silently, sometimes with questions that revealed his growing understanding of the complexities of human behavior. These conversations became a bridge between past and present, shaping a moral and emotional foundation that would guide him long after he left the safety and structure of our home. One particularly quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in warm hues of orange and pink, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. From waiting at the door and being ignored, to reclaiming autonomy and establishing a home that fostered care, learning, and reflection, every step had been deliberate. I realized that true satisfaction does not come from revenge or confrontation, but from the quiet assertion of one's dignity, the careful cultivation of meaningful relationships, and the ability to witness the natural unfolding of consequences without interference. Tyler, seated beside me on the porch, quietly noted the colors of the sky, his attention absorbed, his presence grounding me in the reality of what we had rebuilt together. Our afternoons also included visits to the local community center. I shared my experiences in small groups, educating others about elder rights, financial safety, and the importance of asserting one's autonomy. Tyler accompanied me often, learning through observation the subtle ways in which advocacy can influence change. These interactions reinforced my understanding that the lessons I had fought to embody were not merely personal, but also communal. The power of example, when combined with patience and careful instruction, could ripple outward, impacting lives beyond our immediate household. Tyler, witnessing these exchanges, began to comprehend the weight of responsibility and the significance of standing for justice even when direct confrontation is unnecessary. One Saturday, we decided to plant a small vegetable garden in the backyard. Tyler, sleeves rolled up, soil under his nails, showed a dedication that was both inspiring and instructive. As we worked side by side, I spoke to him about patience, consistency, and the importance of tending not just to plants, but to relationships and responsibilities. He listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed his emerging understanding of cause and effect, of investment and reward, and of the quiet power of deliberate action. The garden became a living metaphor for the principles I had lived, and now sought to pass forward, a daily reminder that growth requires care, attention, and thoughtful patience. Over the following days, the rhythm of our lives continued to reinforce lessons of resilience, autonomy, and moral clarity. Tyler became increasingly confident, moving with purpose in the home, contributing to tasks, and internalizing the principles we practice daily. Observing him, I realized that the work of raising a child is never truly finished. It evolves with the changing dynamics of life, becoming a partnership built on trust, guidance, and shared understanding. The stability and growth we cultivated together became a source of profound satisfaction, far beyond the temporary satisfaction of witnessing someone else's remorse or discomfort. One evening, I noticed Jason lingering near the curb, a distant figure observing from a distance. Tyler, seated beside me, whispered, "Grandma, he's watching again." I nodded, acknowledging the presence without reacting. There was no need for confrontation. The lessons had been delivered through consequence and observation, and the quiet assertion of autonomy had made the point more effectively than any verbal confrontation ever could. Tyler, understanding the unspoken message, smiled faintly. The garden, the home, and our deliberate life had become a living testament to patience, care, and moral integrity in education, far more profound than any lecture or argument could convey. As the month drew to a close, Tyler and I reflected on what we had built together. The home, the garden, and the rhythms of daily life had become a sanctuary, not merely from the past, but for the cultivation of growth, learning, and resilience. We continued to document our days, the small victories, and the lessons learned. Tyler's notebooks grew thick with observations, sketches, and reflections, each page a testament to the power of mindful attention, consistent effort, and the assertion of dignity in the face of neglect or betrayal. The following morning, Tyler woke early as usual, humming a tune that had become his personal anthem of independence and growth. I found him at the breakfast table, carefully measuring ingredients for pancakes, his small hands moving with surprising precision. I smiled, watching him work. There was a quiet grace in his dedication, a reflection of the lessons we had cultivated over the weeks. The scent of warm batter and cinnamon filled the kitchen, wrapping around us like a gentle reminder that life, even in the simplest moments, can be both comforting and profound. These mornings had become sacred, a time of grounding and presence, far removed from the chaos of the past and the shadows of those who had attempted to diminish us. After breakfast, we moved to the garden, where the roses were thriving, a living testament to resilience and patience. Tyler carried a small watering can with a level of care that impressed me. I watched him move from plant to plant, noticing the subtle signs of growth, the small buds on each stem, and the way the sunlight kissed the petals just right. I realized that these moments were teaching him more than gardening. They were lessons in attention, care, and the quiet rewards of consistent effort. "Grandma," he said, pausing to observe a rose fully open. "It's like they're smiling at us." I nodded, feeling a warmth that went beyond pride. It was the profound satisfaction of knowing that the values we had fought to embody were taking root in another generation. We spent the afternoon organizing the house, a task that had evolved from necessity into ritual. Each object we touched, each space we arranged, carried a sense of intention and presence. Tyler learned not just to tidy, but to honor the space, understanding that a home is more than walls and furniture. It is a reflection of care, identity, and personal history. I explained to him that when people neglect spaces or treat them carelessly, it mirrors the neglect they may offer to relationships and responsibilities. He listened thoughtfully, nodding as if absorbing a lesson that would shape the way he moved through life in ways I could not yet see. Across the street, the house remained quiet, a hollow reminder of past conflict. Jason and Danielle were gone, leaving behind only memories and echoes of entitlement. Tyler, curious as ever, asked why they had left so suddenly. I chose my words carefully, emphasizing the importance of choices, consequences, and personal responsibility. "Sometimes," I said, "people walk away when they realize they can't control the story anymore. They may not understand why, but their absence is often the consequence of their own actions." Tyler absorbed this silently, understanding that not all lessons come with explanation, and that observation often teaches more than conversation ever could. That evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, I reflected on the transformation we had undergone. From the despair of being abandoned and underestimated, to reclaiming agency and creating a life defined by intention and care, the journey had been both arduous and illuminating. I realized that peace was not granted. It was cultivated, nurtured through patience, resilience, and the deliberate choice to focus on what could be controlled rather than lamenting what could not. Tyler, sitting beside me on the porch with a cup of tea, seemed to sense this, his small hand occasionally brushing mine, a quiet affirmation of trust and connection. The days continued in a rhythm that fostered growth, both in the garden and in Tyler's understanding of the world. We explored local markets, selecting fresh ingredients and learning to identify quality produce. We spoke about the importance of community, of offering support where it is needed, and of standing firm when one's rights are challenged. Tyler, with his notebook ever present, recorded observations, reflections, and sketches, building a personal archive of lessons learned, not through theory, but through lived experience. I knew that these moments, seemingly ordinary, were crafting the foundation of character, resilience, and moral clarity that would guide him throughout life. One morning, as we worked in the garden, I noticed a letter slip beneath the door. Tyler picked it up with curiosity, his eyes widening as he observed the official seal. It was from a local elder advocacy group, inviting me to speak about my experiences and the importance of asserting autonomy in the face of neglect and legal exploitation. I smiled quietly, recognizing the opportunity not only to share my story, but to influence a broader audience and prevent others from enduring what I had survived. Tyler, observing my reaction, asked, "Grandma, are you nervous?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "Nervousness is for uncertainty. This is purpose, and purpose gives courage." He nodded, seemingly understanding, though his youth meant he could only grasp a fraction of the weight carried by such advocacy. We spent the next few days preparing my speech, refining points, and creating visual aids. Tyler assisted, offering insights about clarity, simplicity, and the power of storytelling. He reminded me to focus not only on the injustice, but on the path to reclaiming agency and peace, and on the actionable lessons that listeners could apply in their own lives. His perspective, fresh and unjaded, provided a clarity that I valued immensely. Together we honed the narrative, ensuring that it conveyed not just suffering, but triumph, agency, and the practical strategies that had restored dignity to our lives. The day of the presentation arrived, and I felt a quiet anticipation, the kind that comes from knowing one is about to transform experience into shared wisdom. Tyler accompanied me, standing beside me as I entered the room filled with attentive faces, mostly women, many of them older, some hesitant, some burdened with their own experiences of neglect or marginalization. I began by recounting the story of Jason and Danielle, carefully emphasizing not sensationalism, but the lessons in autonomy, observation, and deliberate response. The audience listened with rapt attention, nodding at moments of recognition, sometimes murmuring in empathy, occasionally wiping away tears. Tyler observed silently, absorbing not only my words, but the way the room responded to truth spoken with authority and calm assurance. After the presentation, I was approached by several attendees, each sharing their own experiences of being underestimated, neglected, or exploited. Tyler watched as I listened, offered guidance, and shared strategies for asserting rights and reclaiming agency. The exchange reinforced the value of storytelling as a tool for empowerment, not only for those who have experienced hardship, but for those seeking to prevent it. Tyler's presence reminded me that the work of mentorship and guidance is cyclical. What is learned and shared in one generation becomes the foundation for the next. Returning home that evening, we sat on the porch once more, reflecting on the day. Tyler remarked quietly, "Rama, you helped so many people today." I smiled, a gentle warmth spreading through me. "Not because I wanted to," I said softly, "but because the truth matters and action guided by integrity matters even more. People need to see that strength isn't loud, that dignity isn't given, it's asserted, carefully, consistently, and with intention." Tyler nodded, seeming to internalize the principle, his youthful mind already shaping the lessons into a framework he would carry into his future. The following week, I received a call from Monica Reeves. She updated me on the legal closure of the property across the street. Jason had left town quietly, without confrontation or appeal. Danielle had followed, retreating into her own world of avoidance and reflection. The house, once a symbol of conflict and loss, now stood empty, a reminder of choices, consequences, and the quiet efficacy of patience and deliberate action. Tyler, curious as ever, asked what we should do with the empty lot across the street. I suggested replant wildflowers, creating a buffer of beauty and continuity, a reminder that life moves forward regardless of past actions, and that nurturing growth is always preferable to harboring resentment. That afternoon, Tyler and I began planting the wildflowers, laughing as petals brushed our hands, as bees flitted about, and as the wind carried the scent of earth and bloom across the neighborhood. Each seed represented a new beginning, a tangible symbol of the life we had rebuilt together. I watched Tyler move with care and intention, understanding that these lessons would resonate long after the flowers had grown tall. The rhythm of planting, watering, and observing became a meditation, a practice of mindfulness and presence, reinforcing the principles of agency, resilience, and the quiet power of deliberate action. As the weeks turned into months, the rhythm of our new life settled into a quiet, nurturing cadence. Tyler became more confident with each passing day, not only in the garden or the kitchen, but in the way he moved through the world. I noticed small changes: how he carried himself, how he spoke with intention, how he observed and reflected before reacting. It was a subtle evolution, but profound. I realized then that the most powerful legacies are not in wealth, titles, or possessions, but in the values and habits we instill in the next generation. These lessons, once rooted, grow quietly yet persistently, guiding the choices and character of those who inherit them. One morning, I found Tyler sitting on the porch with a notebook, writing in the soft light of the rising sun. He looked up at me and said, "Grandma, I think I understand now. Being strong isn't about being the loudest or the meanest. It's about patience, observation, and knowing when to act. I felt a swell of pride, tempered by gratitude. These were precisely the lessons I had fought so hard to embody, lessons forged through years of sacrifice, betrayal, resilience, and reclamation. He had absorbed them naturally, without the need for lectures or imposed authority. It was a quiet victory, one that would shape him in ways even he could not yet fully comprehend. As we moved through our days, small joys became profound markers of progress. Tyler's laughter during a shared project, the scent of fresh-baked bread, the blooms in the garden, all of these ordinary moments carried extraordinary meaning. They represented survival, renewal, and the triumph of careful, deliberate choices over the chaos of betrayal. I often found myself reflecting on how easily life can slip through the fingers of those who are passive or compliant, and how much strength it takes to reclaim control once it has been challenged or stolen. I wanted Tyler to see that strength is neither flashy nor immediate. It is cultivated over time, patiently and deliberately. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail, hand-addressed and marked with the seal of the community center. It invited me to participate in a panel discussion about elder justice, focusing on advocacy, legal literacy, and empowerment for older adults who had been marginalized or exploited. I looked at Tyler, who had grown quiet and contemplative, and I knew that this was another opportunity to transform personal experience into shared wisdom. Together we reviewed the letter, planned talking points, and discussed strategies for making the message accessible, actionable, and emotionally resonant for the audience. Tyler was keen to assist, offering fresh perspectives that highlighted clarity, empathy, and practical advice. The day of the panel arrived, and we walked into the community center with a mixture of anticipation and calm determination. Tyler held my hand briefly before taking his place at my side, and together we faced an audience composed largely of older adults, caregivers, and advocates. I began by recounting my personal journey, being underestimated, betrayed, and forcibly removed from my home. But I framed the narrative not as a tale of victimhood, but as a story of agency reclaimed. I emphasized practical lessons, from documenting finances and legal documents to observing behavior and responding deliberately rather than impulsively. Tyler quietly assisted, reading selected notes and offering clarifying points that made the story more approachable and engaging. The audience was deeply engaged, some nodding in recognition, others taking notes, and a few wiping away tears. I realized then that our experience resonated far beyond the personal. It reflected a collective anxiety and fear faced by many older adults. By sharing not only the hardship but the strategies for reclaiming control, we provided a template for empowerment that transcended personal narrative. Tyler, observing the reactions, understood that storytelling can be a tool not only for catharsis but for practical change, a lesson that would stay with him well beyond this particular event. Returning home that evening, we sat together on the porch, reflecting on the impact of the day. "Grandma," Tyler said softly, "you didn't just tell your story, you helped people take back control of their lives." I smiled, the warmth of pride mingled with a deep satisfaction. "Yes, baby," I said, "because our stories have power when told with honesty, intention, and courage. And the truth, when combined with action, can change lives, not just ours, but others too." Tyler's eyes brightened as he absorbed the weight of the lesson, and I knew that these experiences, layered and intentional, were building a framework of resilience, morality, and awareness that would guide him throughout life. In the quiet of the following days, we continued to nurture the garden, refine our home, and engage with our community. Tyler developed a routine of journaling each evening, reflecting on the lessons of the day, the observations he had made, and the insights he had gleaned from our experiences. His reflections were thoughtful, often insightful, demonstrating a depth of understanding and emotional intelligence that was remarkable for his age. I encouraged him, praising his observations and guiding him to think critically about cause and effect, responsibility, and the power of deliberate action. Meanwhile, I began reconnecting with neighbors and friends, extending gestures of kindness, sharing resources, and offering guidance where it was requested. This engagement created a network of support and community awareness that reinforced the lessons Tyler and I were cultivating. I observed the quiet ripple effect of intentional action. Small acts of care, when multiplied across relationships, generate a sense of security, trust, and mutual respect that strengthens the social fabric. Tyler participated in these interactions, observing the dynamics and practicing empathy, communication, and patience. Weeks later, I received news that the house across the street had been sold to a family who appreciated its history and potential. I felt a sense of closure, not because of vindication, but because justice had been restored through deliberate, lawful action rather than anger or retaliation. Tyler, ever perceptive, asked why we hadn't reclaimed the property ourselves. I explained that our goal was never to dominate or punish, but to assert boundaries, restore dignity, and create a life of peace. The choice to allow the house to belong to those who would respect it reinforced the principle that true empowerment is measured not by ownership or revenge, but by integrity and restraint. As autumn approached, the neighborhood transformed, leaves falling in golden cascades across the lawns, mirroring the shifts in our own lives. Tyler and I spent our evenings raking leaves, creating compost, and discussing the cycles of nature as metaphors for human experience. We spoke about resilience, impermanence, and the importance of cultivating patience, humility, and foresight. Tyler's insights deepened with each discussion, and I marveled at the way he absorbed lessons not through instruction alone, but through lived experience and reflective dialogue. These conversations, layered with context and reflection, would serve as a foundation for his moral and emotional development for years to come. One evening, I received a phone call from a woman who had attended the panel discussion. She shared her own story of being neglected and misrepresented by her family, expressing gratitude for the clarity, guidance, and empowerment she had gained from hearing my experience. Tyler listened silently, absorbing the human impact of advocacy, storytelling, and principled action. He understood that our experiences were no longer just personal. They were part of a larger narrative of justice, awareness, and resilience that could influence and inspire others. This realization, subtle yet profound, reinforced the value of transparency, courage, and deliberate action in shaping outcomes for oneself and for the community. As the year progressed, Tyler and I continued to cultivate our home, garden, and routines. We introduced small traditions such as Sunday baking, evening walks, and shared storytelling sessions, which fostered a sense of continuity, belonging, and reflection. These routines became rituals of stability and emotional grounding, counterbalancing the disruption and betrayal of the past. Tyler's growth was evident in his increasing independence, empathy, and understanding of boundaries. He engaged with the world thoughtfully, demonstrating discernment and respect, qualities that were nurtured through our deliberate, reflective approach to everyday life. One afternoon, as we pruned the roses together, Tyler asked, "Grandma, do you ever feel angry when you think about Jason and Danielle?" I paused, considering my response carefully. "Anger," I said, "is fleeting. It doesn't build or heal anything. What matters is the way we reclaim control, assert boundaries, and live in alignment with our values. That is where true peace and power lie." Tyler nodded, internalizing the lesson with the seriousness of youth beginning to understand the complexities of human relationships. I realized then that the culmination of our journey was not merely survival, but transformation and enduring framework for navigating life with dignity, integrity, and compassion.